challenging subjects.
I'm joined here by a local audience who are going to be putting their tough questions to my top panel.
Bringing people together.
Are the current sanctions effective?
To get to the answers.
Is there a chance of a revolution in Russia?
What can Africa teach the world?
Can the EU cope?
Are you helping us to win or not to collapse?
You're looking at me, but you've got to be looking at him.
Join the conversation and get your voice heard. Global Questions on BBC World News.
Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Angry words at the G20 summit. Russia says the West is using blackmail to isolate it over the war in Ukraine. The US says it is unwavering in its support for Kyiv. We'll ask if there's any chance of a diplomatic solution to the fighting. Also ahead, protests in Greece at the head-on train collision, which killed at least 42. There have been resignations and court appearances, but will that be enough to end the anger? And an area of natural beauty under threat in the Philippines as a sunken tanker starts to leak oil. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome to the programme. We begin in India, where G20 foreign ministers are meeting. There have already been angry exchanges between Russia and the US over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Russia says there will be no joint declaration at the end of the summit. The US Secretary of State said the talks have been marred by the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russian officials, meanwhile, said Moscow and Beijing had agreed to oppose what they called Western blackmail and threats, but this hasn't been confirmed by China. I'm joined now by the BBC's diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams. And Paul, we really have been seeing tensions simmer over the war in Ukraine, but now it's full-blown in our faces with the two foreign ministers there.
Yes, I think this was always, frankly, Yalda, pretty inevitable. You know, despite Indian intentions, their theme for their presidency of the G20 is, and I quote, "One Earth, one family, one future." That was always likely to be a rather fond hope in the face of the furious row that continues and has done for the past year over the war in Ukraine. You know, India and other members of the G20, particularly the countries known as the Global South, if you like, might have wanted this to focus on the pressing economic issues of the day. Food security, energy insecurity, and so forth. But inevitably, the war reared its head, as it did when the G20 last year. And as a result, amid significant recriminations, you had a statement which was not a joint statement by the foreign ministers. It was a summary by the hosts, by the Indians, and the Chinese and the Russians refused to sign it. So very much, I think, an expected outcome, but a depressing one, given the sheer range of challenges which that closing statement refers to.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Paul, no declaration will be signed. The Russian foreign minister and the US Secretary of State met for less than 10 minutes. The question then, and it's turned into sort of a war of words, the question then is, what's the point of these summits then?
Well, yes, so I mean, there was that meeting, and it is, I think, the first time the two men have met face to face, separately, as it were, since the war began. So, you know, make of that what you will. It was a very brief meeting, and it doesn't sound from what either man said publicly as if there was any meeting of minds, but any kind of communication, any contact is obviously something that has potential value. But I think, you know, in general terms, to your question about the value of these meetings, inevitably, at a time of a global conflict that has preoccupied so many people for such a long time, the scope for progress on the pressing issues of the day is inevitably limited. But I think, you know, there was probably a tussle going on between the Russians and the Americans for the ears of the other ministers there, the Brazilians, the South Africans, the Indians, the Saudis. You know, both Russia and the United States want to keep, to the extent that they can, those countries on board and try and persuade them that their view of this ongoing conflict in Ukraine is the one that those countries should adhere to. The Americans know that they have an uphill battle because, you know, Russia's influence, particularly in Africa, remains very considerable. And the Global South is not necessarily convinced by all the arguments that the West has presented about the war in Ukraine. So this would have been a forum for a lot of bilateral conversations at which those arguments and counter-arguments will have been pressed, with Sergei Lavrov and Antony Blinken anxious to try and keep alongside and to persuade their counterparts.
Yeah, because, you know, the point is, Adam, that there are all these other issues as a result of the war, the energy crisis, the food crisis, the debt crisis, that all of these other countries are feeling and would want to discuss.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, take a country like India. You know, India is in a somewhat stronger position, ironically, as a result of the war, because it has bought a lot of Russian oil. Russia has turned to India as one of the countries which it can continue to do business with over the past 12 months. And yet, you know, the West would like India to use its influence to try and moderate, to try and persuade Russia not to go down the path that it's on. So you know, some of these countries are using that influence to try and to press their case for the sorts of things that they are interested in. You know, this was always going to be a difficult meeting. I think the war in Ukraine will continue to overshadow this and all other international gatherings for the foreseeable future.
Okay, Paul, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there. Now, let's go to the rest of the day's news. And Greece has appointed a new transport minister following the train crash that killed 42 people. Georgios Gerapetritis said he had a mandate to modernise the country's railway and restore its safety. His predecessor resigned after the disaster, saying the system wasn't fit for the 20th century. Protests erupted in the country, with many seeing the accident as one that had been waiting to happen. Some took place in Thessaloniki and the city of Larissa, near where the disaster happened on Tuesday night. Rioters also clashed with police outside the headquarters of Hellenic Train in Athens, the company responsible for maintaining Greece's railways. The government has said an independent investigation will deliver justice. 3 days of national mourning have been declared across the country following the incident. Our Europe correspondent Nick Beek sent this report.
The aftermath of Greece's worst ever rail disaster. A station master in a nearby city has now been charged with manslaughter by negligence. And already the country's Prime Minister says tragic human error was to blame. But that has sparked anger overnight, including in the capital Athens, because for years there have been warnings the rail network was not safe. This surgeon, who came out of retirement to help the injured, says the many young lives lost were the victims of systemic failings.
It's a disaster, it's a catastrophic thing. Families are crying tonight. Unfortunately, the majority of the wounded, of the lost people are young students. They left home happy after the long weekend to go for their studies, to see their relatives, and never reached their case.
This is one of the hospitals where survivors and the injured have been treated. It's also where some family members have been coming to give their DNA in the hope that maybe any sort of samples that are recovered from the scene today will be matched to their loved ones who are still missing.
The force of the explosions were captured on camera, 2 fireballs ripping through the carriages. Visiting the wreckage, Greece's transport minister became emotional as he talked about the country's failing train network and later resigned. It's not known exactly how many passengers are missing, but many families now face an agonising wait.
Big reporting there. Well, I'm joined now by journalist and producer Daphne Tollis, who's in Tempe, which is the municipality where the collision took place. Thanks very much, Daphne, for joining us. There is just so much anger right now, with so many people saying that this was an accident waiting to happen.
Yes, exactly. This is correct. The president of the Association of Greek Train Drivers told the state broadcaster ERT that they have been asking, complaining, and that nothing has been working for quite some time. But the central monitor system was not properly functioning. It was in place but not implemented. That the light signals were not working. So he was warning for this quite some time now. Of course, we're here now at the site. I'm here. You can see this behind me. They are still rescue operations are still ongoing, but the chief of the fire service was here on location. He said that the 80 to 85% of the operation will probably end tonight, but they will remain on location for as long as is needed. No indication of any survivors, he said, but they will remain here just because families, the relatives need some closure. So anything that they need to find this closure, because bodies have been recovered, they have been sent to the hospital for identifications by the Greek coroners.
Yeah, Daphne, I just want you to show us what's happening behind you. You say that the rescue operation it continues. Just if you could tell us a little bit more, because yesterday we knew that some family members were standing by the highway waiting for any kind of news as the rescue workers rummaged through the wreckage to look for signs of life.
Exactly. Today is the second day basically of the rescue operations. You can see cranes behind me. They stopped overnight for safety and security reasons. They resumed again this morning to pick up, lift the debris, the rail cars, and find any missing body parts, anything that could be sent to the coroner. Because as the chief of the fire service says, sadly, the bodies that were found here, especially late as the days proceed, were dismembered, disfigured. So it was like he said on the phone, he said it's like a war zone.
Yeah, so, I mean, and so many young people on that train, mostly university students.
So many young people. This is like a normal train itinerary. It leaves Athens, it goes to Thessaloniki. So past the town of Larissa, where people had boarded and disembarked. The accident happened like 20 minutes later after the town of Larissa. It was approximately 1 hour and a half before Thessaloniki, Greece's second largest town. People were returning, young people, students were returning from the carnival celebrations that what we had last weekend. We had a 3-day, a long holiday, long weekend, which precedes, which actually it indicates, the beginning of Lent season in Greece.
Yeah, and Daphne, there is a lot of talk about infrastructure. And we've heard from the Greek Prime Minister, we had the Transport Minister who has resigned. But overall, what kind of political ramifications do you think this is going to have?
Well, we will have to see exactly, because, the full investigation, as the Prime Minister pledged, is ongoing, and they will perform a thorough investigation. Of course, the infrastructure issues predated Greece's financial crisis, where the country required loans from European creditors, international editors. But these problems they intensified during the austerity period, together with all the measures that Greece had to take. So we are let's say 1 month, 1.5 months before the elections. We are just, we will have to see, because I think it's still very soon, but for sure the people here are angry. They knew, the locals, the Greek people knew that there are problems with Greece's railway system and the infrastructure. And this was, as you said, was a mistake, an error that was waiting
to happen. Devastating situation there in Greece. Daphne, thank you so much for bringing us up to date. Now, a tanker that sunk in the Philippines on Tuesday has started to leak its cargo of oil, threatening to pollute nearby marine reserves. The ship, called Princess Empress, went down in the rough seas near the island of Mindoro after its engines failed. Search teams are trying to locate the sunken vessel so they can siphon off the oil. Well, joining me now is our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow. And Michael, just bring us up to date, because the rescue, the search sort of operation continues.
It does. It's moved to a more critical stage, though, and the time is more valuable at the moment. When this ship first went down on Tuesday in rough seas, as you said, off the island of Mindoro, there was a sense that actually the cargo on board, that's 800,000 litres of fuel, was okay. It was, even though the vessel is underwater, it was somehow sealed, and once they located the vessel, they could then siphon it off. Now it appears that the cargo is leaking out and is causing increasing amount of damage. Oil has been washed up on some of the beaches of the island. It's been spotted in the sea as well. The Coast Guard has taken a number of samples of the water. So the race is really on twofold. One, to stop the oil spreading by dispersing it in the sea or kind of collecting it and pouring chemicals on it, and also locating the vessel so they can actually get that cargo off.
Michael, just tell us about this particular area. I mean, is it well known to tourists, to divers? Do people go here? Is there a lot of marine life that's quite rare as well?
Well, that's the problem. Yes, there is a lot of all those things. Over the last few years, this area has developed as a tourist destination, in part because it's been slightly overlooked previously. And in fact, near where this ship went down, there are 21 marine reserves. A lot of biodiversity in the sea there, so you can see on those, on environmental terms, on tourism terms, there's great interest and a rush to try and stop this oil slick developing. Also, fishing. Hundreds of thousands of people in this particular area depend on fishing for their livelihoods, and obviously that's under threat if this oil gets out in large quantities. So on both those counts, it's urgent. It's an urgent need to try and find
as you say, it really is a race against time. Do they have the sort of ability to try and curb this and stop it from happening?
Well, they do have some ability. They've been using spotter planes to try and see where this ship might have gone down, because they're not exactly sure. Also, they're bringing in, I've just seen the Philippine Coast Guard said they're bringing in a number of private cleanup companies to try and get the oil which has already arrived on the beach. So I think they've upped the gears in terms of trying to both get the oil and find the ship so that they can stop any more leaking out.
Michael, thank you so much for bringing us up to date. Stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, this is the 5-bedroom house Harry and Meghan left behind when they moved to California. Now King Charles is taking it back. We'll ask what that means for the relationship between the royal father and son.
To choose Grana Padano is to embrace its unique Italian values. A moment to be shared. Grana Padano, an Italian feeling.
This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex have been asked to vacate their British base, Frogmore Cottage. The couple's spokesperson has confirmed they were reportedly told to leave the property by Buckingham Palace in January, days after Prince Harry published his memoir Spare. The home in the grounds of Windsor Castle had allegedly been offered to the Duke of York. Buckingham Palace is yet to comment. Our royal correspondent Sarah Campbell reports.
Since leaving the UK for a new life in the States, Prince Harry and his wife Meghan have returned just a handful of times. And when they've done so, such as last June for the Jubilee, they've stayed in Frogmore Cottage, the house gifted to them by the late Queen. The 5-bedroom property is situated within the grounds of Windsor Castle. The Duke and Duchess spent more than £2 million on rent and refurbishments, according to royal accounts. But their spokesperson has confirmed the Sussexes have now been asked to vacate the property. Once again, it's put royal relations back on the front pages, with the King reported to have sanctioned the move and Prince Andrew allegedly being lined up to move in once the Sussexes are out. Buckingham Palace has offered no comment on what are considered private family matters. This all comes in the wake of Prince Harry's memoir Spare and the publicity campaign which accompanied it, and their 6-part TV series, putting the couple's grievances with the royal family in front of a global audience. In just 2 months' time, Harry's father, King Charles, will be crowned. It's still unclear whether Harry, his youngest son, and Meghan will be there to witness it. Sarah Campbell, BBC News.
Well, joining me now is Ian Lloyd. He's a writer, photographer and royal commentator. Thanks very much, Ian, for joining us here on the programme. I just want to get your reaction to this bit of news. It was clearly, if they were told in January, it doesn't come as a total surprise.
Hello, Yalda. No, it won't come as a surprise to them. I think it's come as a surprise to us because we didn't really know this was going to happen. But at the time of the publication of the book and the Netflix series, we were led to believe there could be some sort of statement from Buckingham Palace or the King or somebody to say against what's Harry's and Meghan's allegations were, but nothing was stated. I mean, last time with the Oprah Winfrey show, the Queen and Buckingham Palace said memories may vary and so on. So there was a bit of a statement then, but there was nothing this time. So this is the first time that the royal family has hit back, and it's quite significant because it's taking away Harry and Meghan's only home in the United Kingdom, and it's where they're domiciled in the United Kingdom. So it effectively stops Harry from ever being a Councillor of State because he doesn't live in this country, and also it affects the security because he one of his arguments is, as a member of the royal family, he should be entitled to security when he's in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, and on many levels, further kind of sours the relationship.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, talk about burning bridges. I mean, it's more or less blown the relationship out of the water, and obviously also affecting Prince Andrew, who is supposed to be. Charles is supposed to want his brother to live in this relatively small accommodation. I mean, at the moment he's in Royal Lodge, which has 30 rooms and 7 bedrooms. Frogmore Cottage is a lot smaller, and Andrew will be presumably incensed by it because his younger brother Prince Edward has Bagshot Park, which has over 100 rooms, and he's been negotiated a 150-year lease on it. So his place, if you like, is secure, whereas Andrew's is.
I suppose the Prince Andrew question is a whole other conversation in terms of what the family does with him.
Yeah, absolutely, and it also means what will happen with Harry and Meghan if they do come in the future. I mean, it'll be a bit like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who didn't have a home here in the United Kingdom. So the Duke, when he came on his own, would stay with Queen Mary, his mother. But in later years, they would stay at Claridge's at a hotel, and that's the only real option open to the Sussexes if they come, which they're not going to be very happy with for security reasons and status, I suppose.
And I suppose Frogmore House, it was a gift to them from the Queen.
Well, it was leased to them by the Crown Estate. Obviously the Queen agreed to it. It's Frogmore Cottage, by the way. Frogmore House is
Frogmore Cottage,
a vast building.
Yes.
Nearby. But yes, it was. They last renegotiated it in March last year when the Queen was alive, in March of 2022. So it's presumably on a regular lease rather than a long-term lease. So I suppose that's the get out for the royal family and the Crown Estate, is that it's not leased for many years. But of course, if they did spend 2.4 million upgrading it and making it the home they wanted, and presumably it's full of their stuff, so that's going to be a bit of a problem negotiating all of that, I would think.
Yeah, and I suppose the other question is, will they come to the coronation?
Well, I mean, this sort of is an argument why they probably won't. I mean, they've not said whether they're coming or not, and I really think this could possibly turn them completely against the idea. And obviously it does give them ammunition for any future books and documentaries that they're producing at their end. I mean, Meghan's supposed to be writing kept a journal and supposed to be writing a book, so that it gives them more fuel to against the royal family. But it certainly doesn't build bridges, does it? It's really it's just weakening the whole thought of a kind of bringing the family together, and it could mean that Prince Charles doesn't see his grandchildren for many years. Who knows?
Yeah, indeed.
Sorry, King Charles, I should say.
Yeah, Ian Lloyd, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you, Yalda.
We'll be back with all the latest headlines in the next few minutes. Don't go anywhere. Of course, you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim, but we'll be continuing the conversation around the G20, that foreign ministers meeting. We're expecting to hear from the US Secretary of State in the next half hour, so do stay with us for that.
Hello there. Storm Juliet is still going to give a lot of wet weather through the course of Thursday into Friday across parts of Sicily and Corsica, Sardinia, Italy, across into the Balkans and down into Greece as well. Strong winds around that system, and also developing out of Africa, another weather front joins in from Malta as well, some wet weather in parts of Tunisia. So really still quite a lot of wet weather, disruptive winds, gales around the Adriatic coastline. Further south and east it's a little bit drier, but we pick up the showers further north across Turkey. We've got some chillier air filtering southwards across parts of Spain and Portugal. We've got similar issues with some chilly weather under the high pressure for the Low Countries and the United Kingdom. Then some really windy weather, further snowfall to come across Scandinavia, and some strong winds and Arctic air across Iceland as well. And that's all heading southwards, that colder air. Still, you can see this storm Juliet is with us, giving some nasty weather through the Mediterranean, across southern parts of Italy, into the Balkans, into Greece, into Turkey as well, pushing its way gradually eastwards with time, allowing the cold air to dig in behind. So temperatures falling away, for example, in London, and some more unsettled, showery looking picture here and for Paris. Some rains arriving, or showers at least, for Madrid as well. It stays looking wintry in Moscow, and some showers still around this weekend in Athens.
To choose Grana Padano is to embrace its unique Italian values. A moment to be shared. Grana Padano, an Italian feeling.
Now showing on BBC Real.
Carries with it death, devastation, beauty. This incredible jewel has not just been passed down through generations, it's been stolen, it's been fought over, it's gone through all manner of chicanery and skullduggery to get it to its current point.
The Kohinoor, 105 carats, oval-shaped, and arguably the world's most famous diamond. Today, it's set among 2,800 other stones in the crown jewels, but it made a public appearance in 2002 atop the Queen Mother's coffin, and again in 2022 at Queen Elizabeth's funeral. In the days following the Queen's death, the word Kohinoor began to trend on Twitter. Many Indians were calling for the diamond to be returned, but the Kohinoor has been stolen and moved countless times over its long history. The question remains, where might it go next?
Watch more stories like this at bbc.com/real.
Whoa! There is art all over Istanbul, but this has to be the strangest of all.
Music is such an important tool in our lives, not just to bring pleasure, but also to heal and to bring hope.
We're just in a period now that African brands are just owning that, owning what we have and projecting it in however they see fit.
I just love this place because this is somewhere where memory itself is set in stone.
Inspiring arts and culture on BBC World News.
In our connected world, all news is international. So, for in-depth analysis,
the impact on Europe and the rest of the world would be devastating.
And correspondents covering both home and global events, get a deeper understanding and find out what is really going on.
BBC World News America.
Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Angry words over Ukraine at the G20 meeting. Russia says the West is using blackmail to isolate it over the war in Ukraine. Washington says Antony Blinken spoke to his Russian counterpart for just 10 minutes. He's about to give his closing speech. We'll bring it to you live. And millions of children around the world are getting into character to celebrate World Book Day. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome back to the programme. We begin again in India, where G20 foreign ministers are meeting. There have already been angry exchanges between Russia and the US over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Russia says there will be no joint declaration at the end of the summit. The US Secretary of State said the talks have been marred by the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russian officials, meanwhile, said Moscow and Beijing had agreed to oppose what they called Western blackmail and threats, but this hasn't been confirmed by China. Well, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi called on foreign ministers to put their differences aside and find common ground.
It is but natural that your discussions are affected by the geopolitical tensions of the day. We all have our positions and our perspectives on how this tension should be resolved. However, at the leading economies of the world, we also have a responsibility toward those who are not in this room.
That was Narendra Modi. Well, as the war in Ukraine takes centre stage at the G20 meeting, fighting on the ground in Ukraine continues. Ukrainian officials say Russian missiles slammed into a 5-story apartment building in the city of Zaporizhia in southeastern Ukraine, killing at least 4 people. Meanwhile, President Zelensky says the country's biggest challenge at the moment is defending another city, Bakhmut. These are the latest pictures from Zaporizhia, where more than 10 apartments were destroyed and emergency service workers can be seen combing through debris. Zaporizhia's mayor said 7 people were injured, including a pregnant woman. These are some of the latest pictures of artillery battles in Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces say that Russian troops had advanced towards the city amid intensified attacks in the region. Well, I'm joined now by Vitaly Sevchenko. He's the Russia editor at BBC Monitoring, and our reporter Zubair Ahmed, who joins us from Delhi. I'll start with you, Vitaly. I mean, we've just gone through the fighting that continues on the ground in Ukraine. So no real surprises that what's going on in Ukraine is overshadowing the G20.
Yes, in a way, what happened in Ukraine overnight with the shelling of the apartment block in Zaporizhia and the continuing fighting around Bakhmut, it's more of the same, nothing surprising. The unexpected and very important development around Ukraine actually happened across the border in Russia, in Bryansk region, where local officials and numerous pro-war, pro-Kremlin media sources have claimed that a group of people they described as Ukrainian subversives, numbering between 40 and 50, infiltrated two villages, allegedly taking hostages, firing at passing cars, and allegedly killing one man. Later, that narrative, unconfirmed, unsubstantiated, it changed into something different, and it was mentioned by President Putin earlier today, who said that it was just one car that was attacked by Ukrainian subversives. But details of that alleged attack remain very, very murky at this moment.
Vitaly, if we're just to pick up on this attack that you're talking about, is this the first time that we've heard Ukrainians accused of this kind of sabotage, on the border or in Russian territory?
It's definitely the first such accusation on this scale, where the number of people in this attack is said to be to 50. Russian regions bordering Ukraine, such as Bryansk, they have come under alleged Ukrainian shelling. Ukraine doesn't say if it was them, but Russia says it's the Ukrainian armed forces shelling Russian border regions. It's been going on for months. But what's unusual about this attack, responsibility for it was later claimed by a Russian opposition group calling itself Russian Volunteer Corps, which says it had crossed from Ukraine and into Russia, and it called on Russians to rebel against their government.
Yeah, we're just showing our viewers that Bryansk region now, as you tell us about it, and that was the governor of the Bryansk region, which borders Ukraine, says saboteurs fired on a car, killing one person. He added that shelling had also taken place from Ukraine. Zubair, I'm just going to bring you into the conversation, because with all this going on the ground in Ukraine, and then, this sort of accusations on both sides, and now the Russians saying this, I mean, no doubt this was going to overshadow the G20 summit. I mean, although India has desperately tried to bring the focus back, and we even heard Narendra Modi there saying, look, people have geopolitical differences. Let's not allow it to completely, prevent us from getting any work done here. But that seems to be what it has done.
Absolutely. India's primary objective during the time of its G20 presidency this year is to be a leading and vocal voice of the global South without jeopardizing its strong ties with the countries of the global North. One could argue it was India's failure to get all parties involved to agree on a joint statement. But I'm aware how much the Indian side had tried. The Indian foreign minister met the Russian foreign minister last night, and then he met the Chinese foreign minister today. A meeting of G20 finance ministers last weekend also had failed to reach a consensus on the language to describe Russia's aggressions in Ukraine, forcing India to issue a chair summary instead of a traditional joint communique. And that is what India has done after the foreign ministers meet.
Zubair, it's a difficult and delicate balancing act for India. It remains a strategic partner for the United States, certainly when it comes to, in the region, when it comes to dealing with China, for example. But on the other hand, as you say, India has maintained its relationship with the Russians as well.
India has indeed, and if you recall several statements of the Indian foreign ministers in the last 1 year since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, India has taken a position where it has not condemned the Russian aggression. Indeed, India has abstained from the UN, the voting in the UN, and as early as last week as well. And indeed, the Indian foreign minister last year, he said he's actually advised the Europeans to come out of the European mindset and do not think that Europe's problem is the world's problem and the world's problem is not Europe's problem. But at the same time, India has maintained very strong ties with the US and Western allies. So it is a difficult balance that India has maintained. But there are people in India who also believe that India has to come out clean and say it is a Russian aggression. But the government line is that India has a strong and historic ties with Russia, and India has to look at its own national interest. And if India imports oil from Russia, it is in their national interest, and that's why it's doing it.
Vitaly, I mean, you and I were watching that speech by President Putin last week, and he remained defiant. It didn't look like he was backing down from his position at all. When we look at these international events with Sergei Lavrov there as well, it's not going to look like at any point that the Russians are going to budge from their position or move in any way towards acknowledging that what's going on in Ukraine isn't working.
Well, I'll put it this way. Nothing that I've seen suggests that Russia or President Putin personally are prepared to de-escalate or back down. More than that, earlier today, about an hour ago, President Putin addressed a meeting of teachers via a video link, and he said that Russia will defeat the people he called Ukrainian nationalists. So he's still defiant and determined to keep on fighting. And he also, at that meeting, he mentioned the alleged attack by Ukrainians in Bryansk region. And President Putin is chairing a meeting of the Russian Security Council tomorrow. So it will be very interesting and important to see if what happened in Bryansk today, it will be used as a reason for Russia to escalate further.
Vitaly, Zubair, thank you both for all of your analysis there here on Impact. Okay, let's just show you these live pictures now from New Delhi, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is about to hold a press conference in the next few minutes after the G20 meeting of foreign ministers. As we said there, the US and its allies are in a war of words with Russia at the G20 summit. Antony Blinken has said that the meeting has been marred by Russia, and Sergei Lavrov says that work on G20 agenda has been turned into a farce. So we are waiting for Antony Blinken to come out and give his final statement there in Delhi. Now, books fuel our imagination and take us to incredible worlds of make-believe, and those at UNESCO who are behind World Book Day say the importance of reading as a child can't be understated. They claim reading for pleasure is the single biggest indicator of a child's future success, more so than family circumstances or their income. But here in the UK, for instance, the National Literacy Trust's annual literacy survey suggests 500,000 children between the age of 8 to 18 don't own even a single book. Well, joining me now is poet and children's author Michael Rosen. He recently wrote the book Getting Better, which reflects on the 3 months he spent in hospital after contracting COVID-19. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us here on the programme. This morning, my 3.5-year-old was so excited about World Book Day and getting into his Gruffalo costume. It is such an exciting day in the year for children, but it's also sad to think that so many children in this country, around the world, don't own books, don't have access to books or libraries.
Well, that's the important thing about libraries that you just mentioned there. Yes, indeed. There are many people who are poor and who may not prioritise books. I don't blame them for that. But that's why it's been so important over the last 100 years or more in countries all over the world to provide libraries for poor people, essentially, so that they can have equal opportunities, equal access to these books that all of us write and hope will enlighten, inform and educate us.
As a child, libraries were sort of at the forefront of my schooling. But do you think now children are reading less because of technological distractions, because they are all on their phones, frankly?
Yes, that's possible. I mean, it's hard to say because children's books do sell very well in this country where I'm speaking from, Britain, and in America. Children's books do sell very well, and where there are libraries, they're incredibly popular. But of course, yes, phones and video and so on, it's all very popular too. But of course, children have to remember quite often texting each other. That is language. It may not be stories and the kinds of things that I try to write, but yes, definitely there is plenty of language and writing going on.
Does reading to children actually help them learn to read?
Oh, yes, because when you read to children, you're giving them as a voice, if you like, the written language. The written language is not the same as the spoken language. And so in some cultures and some languages, it's very, very different. In English, it's perhaps less different. But when we read to them, they get the cadence, the sequences, the structure of the written language, and it just goes into their ears. You know, if you look at a page of writing, it isn't the way we speak. When we speak, we hesitate, we interrupt, we tail off. As I'm speaking now, you can hear me umming and ahhing a bit. That is very different from how we write.
I want to ask about your latest book, which deals with your struggles with COVID and what you went through. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it's actually about struggling with lots of things in my life, struggling with the fact that of trying to figure out my parents, why they never mentioned that they lost a child, or why my father referred to relatives lost in the Holocaust but didn't know anything about them, but then also that I had a very long-term illness, an underactive thyroid that was not diagnosed. And then I lost my own son, my dear son Eddie, when he was nearly 19, and how I came to terms with that. And then my own scrape with death, saved by the wonderful health workers in our NHS, National Health Service in this country. As I say it, I tried to die, but they wouldn't let me.
I know it's extraordinary what people like you and so many others went through in that period during COVID and the help that the NHS offered. There is this big debate in this country now around these leaked messages from the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock. You've expressed anger about those messages, what's come out of it, and slammed the government because of your own struggles.
Yes, I mean, when we see what the government said at the time that we know about, and then actually hear these new leaked statements, it doesn't look as if the government showed due diligence. It doesn't look as if they really, really cared to save the lives, in particular, of old people. And they were not showing due diligence in the way in which they decanted, if I can use that rather horrible word, but decanted old people, geriatric patients from hospitals into care homes where they spread COVID because there wasn't full due diligence in the kind of testing going on. So, of course, that makes me very angry. And also, we've heard comments now from Boris Johnson. He made them at the time saying, look at me, I'm shaking hands with everybody, I'm shaking hands with COVID patients. But we now know that one of his views of COVID at one particular point was that it was no worse than falling downstairs. Well, I've fallen downstairs in my time several times, and I can tell you at the end of it, I wasn't put in an induced coma for 40 days in order to recover. I brushed myself off and got up and walked on. That wasn't what COVID was like for me.
I'm being told to move on, but I just wanted to briefly ask you, do you feel you have a new chance now at life, given what you went through, and will you continue to write these extraordinary books?
Oh, yes, you bet. No, I mean, I think I always thought that this is all we've got. This is our life. My daughter calls me, clever daughter, calls me an optimistic nihilist. That's what you are, Dad, she said. I said, what's that? Well, you don't believe in the afterlife, you don't believe in the deity, but every day you're full of hope. So there we are. That's what my daughter said I am, and I'll accept that.
Michael Rosen, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, we'll have more on the G20 in India, where Russia's invasion of Ukraine is causing quarrels between delegates. You're looking at live pictures where we're waiting for the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to come out and give a statement.
To choose Grana Padano is to embrace its unique Italian values. A moment to be shared. Grana Padano, an Italian feeling.
Worldwide debates on challenging subjects. I'm joined here by a local audience who are going to be putting their tough questions to my top panel, bringing people together.
Are the current sanctions effective?
To get to the answers.
Is there a chance of a revolution in Russia?
What can Africa teach the world?
Can the EU cope?
Are you helping us to win or not to collapse?
You're looking at me, but you've got to be looking at him.
Join the conversation and get your voice heard. Global Questions on BBC World News.
Are you a raver?
Do I look like a raver?
I've got bass in a backpack. This is amazing.
Dancing for like 4 or 5 hours of a gig, you could generate about 800 kilowatt hours of thermal energy.
Right, so shall we give it a taste? And it's my favourite.
We're really talking to the plants, and they're telling us how happy they are.
It can fly, but it can also float on water.
Oh my God, that came by quick. It's all about augmented reality.
Beautiful, right? Beautiful.
Totally and utterly immersed in another world there.
Your Tech Update. Click on BBC World News.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines for Ukraine. Let's look at some of the international reaction. Tell us what you've been hearing. In practical terms, what does that mean? And let's just remind ourselves, this is all part of the same story.
Piece the story together with Ross Atkins. Outside Source on BBC World News.
This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. I just want to show you these live pictures coming in from Delhi, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is about to hold a press conference in the next few minutes after the G20 meeting of foreign ministers. And as we've been reporting here on the programme, there has been a lot of tension between Russia and the United States at this event at the G20. We can see there someone coming up. We may be expecting Secretary Blinken to appear at any minute now. But Russia has accused the West, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, of issuing blackmail and threats against other countries at this meeting in India. And the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, earlier delivered a forceful call on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. Mr. Blinken has been holding meetings with top diplomats from the G20 with the aim of really rallying greater support for Ukraine as it tries to repel an onslaught of Russian troops that we've been reporting on, and braces for a potential new Russian offensive this spring, this offensive that we've been reporting on and talking about, the Russian spring offensive. So as soon as we do see Antony Blinken come out, we will be going to that live. But as we've been saying, there've been a war of words between Russia and the United States at the G20 summit, and we are waiting for the US Secretary of State to come out. Now, in the past couple of hours, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he would find it very difficult to vote for a new deal on post-Brexit trade with Northern Ireland, describing the agreement as handing control to the European Union. Let's just have a listen.
So when I look at the deal that we have now, I, of course, have mixed feelings. I'm conscious of where the political momentum is and people's deep desire just to get on. And this has got to be about the people of Northern Ireland, the 1.9 million people, their businesses and their lives. And given that we have got rid of the bill, I can see why so many people are attracted to accepting a compromise. And I agree passionately with Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, for whom I have the highest regard, that the people of Northern Ireland need their assembly and they need their government. And it's not for me to advise Sir Geoffrey, but I hope that he can find a way of reconciling himself and his party to this outcome, which is the fact that we have, and getting back into Stormont. But, and I am conscious I'm not going to be thanked for saying this, but I think it's my job to do so. We must be clear about what is really going on here. This is not about the UK taking back control. And although there are easements, this is really a version of the solution that was being offered last year to Liz Truss when she was Foreign Secretary. This is the EU graciously unbending to allow us to do what we want in our own country, not by our laws, but by theirs.
That's the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking there a little earlier about the Northern Ireland Protocol and that deal that was struck between Rishi Sunak and Ursula von der Leyen earlier this week. Now, I just want to show you some live pictures from New Delhi, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is about to hold a press conference in the next few minutes after the G20 meeting of foreign ministers. We are expecting Antony Blinken to come out, and there really have been angry exchanges between the United States and Russia at this summit in Delhi over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The US Secretary of State said the talks had been marred by the unprovoked and unjustified attack, but that the West would be unwavering in its support for Kyiv. Russian officials, meanwhile, have said Moscow and Beijing had agreed to oppose what they called Western blackmails and threats, but we haven't had any confirmation from China on that. Russia has also accused the West of undermining efforts to allow grain exports despite the Russian attack, but the US countered by saying Moscow was hampering Ukrainian exports. India has really attempted to promote the G20, whose members account for 85% of the world's GDP at this forum, and wanted to focus on solving big problems. India, as the self-styled voice of the global South, it really wanted to stress the importance of powerful developing countries in that effort. And we heard earlier from Prime Minister Narendra Modi saying there are often geopolitical differences, but we have to put those differences to one side and deal with the bigger problems that we're facing in the international community at the moment. But as we've said, there have been angry exchanges between the United States and Russia, with Russia accusing the United States of blackmail and threats against other countries at that meeting of the G20 nations in the Indian capital. We are expecting Antony Blinken to deliver a message, his statement at the end of this summit, and really focus on Russia withdrawing from Ukraine. But from the statements we've heard from the Russian foreign minister, they do not seem to be backing off and have continued to use forceful language as well against the United States. We will follow the story very closely, and we'll be back in the next few minutes with all the latest headlines.